What is the most terrifying sound in a perfect marriage? It is T, a screaming match. It is T, a slammed door. It S, the crisp sound of tearing paper. Imagine standing in your luxurious penthouse, 6 months pregnant, reaching into your husband's tuxedo pocket for his cufflinks, and pulling out a receipt instead. A receipt for a $45,000 teardrop diamond pendant. A diamond you have never seen. A diamond bought exactly 2 weeks ago, on your seventh wedding anniversary. Your heart stops. The baby kicks. You know instantly that he is lying. But if you scream, if you confront him right now, you lose everything. You are financially dependent, pregnant, and trapped in an empire he controls. So, what do you do? If you are Clara, a former financial analyst who secretly built that very same billion-dollar empire, you don't cry. You smile. You play the devoted, exhausted wife. And in the shadows, you meticulously build a legal trap so flawlessly brutal. He won't even realize his life is over until he's already signed it away. This is a story about the devastating cost of underestimating a woman's loyalty and the terrifying beauty of her calculated survival. If you are ready to witness a masterclass in silent, brilliant revenge, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a perfect plot twist and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Now, let us begin the inspection.
The crisp sound of tearing paper broke the silence of the bedroom. Clara stood in the center of the massive walk-in closet. She was 32 years old, 6 months pregnant, and looking for her husband's silver cufflinks. Vance's tuxedo jacket hung in its garment bag. Clara reached into the inner breast pocket. Her fingers brushed against smooth silk. She expected to find the small velvet box containing his cufflinks. Instead, she felt a folded piece of thick paper. She pulled it out. As she did, the ultrasound photo she had been holding slipped from her grip. It fluttered to the hardwood floor. It landed face up. The black and white image of their unborn daughter stared back at her. Clara did not look down. Her eyes were fixed on the paper in her hand. It was a receipt. The logo at the top belonged to a high-end jeweler on Fifth Avenue. The date was exactly 2 weeks ago. The item description was clear. A Twicarat teardrop diamond pendant on a platinum chain. The total cost was $45,000, paid in full. Clara stopped breathing. 2 weeks ago was their 7th wedding anniversary. Vance had taken her to an extravagant dinner. He had given her a stunning sapphire tennis bracelet. He told her blue was the color of loyalty. He told her it matched her eyes. He did not give her a diamond pendant. Clara stared at the dark ink on the receipt. Her heart began to race against her ribs. The baby gave a sharp, sudden kick against her stomach. It was as if the child felt the sudden flood of adrenaline in her mother's veins. I have never seen this necklace. Someone else is wearing it. Clara closed her eyes. She forced herself to inhale. 1, 2, 3. She folded the receipt carefully. She slipped it into the pocket of her maternity dress. It felt like a burning coal against her thigh. She picked up the ultrasound photo from the floor. She placed it gently on the marble island. Then, she walked out of the closet. The penthouse apartment was massive. It sat 60 floors above the city. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows wrapped around the entire living space. From up here, the world looked small. It looked manageable. But inside these walls, the air was suddenly suffocating. Clara walked toward the kitchen. The catering team was in full swing. The contrast in temperature hit her instantly. The dining room was icy. The air conditioning was cranked high to combat the heat of the summer evening. But the kitchen was sweltering. The heavy, rich smell of roasted lamb and fresh rosemary filled the air. The clattering of silver trays echoed off the white tile walls. Mrs. Sterling, the head chef said, wiping his brow with a towel, "The main course will be ready in 10 minutes. Are the guests seated?" Clara forced a warm, practiced smile. "They are moving to the dining room now, chef. Everything smells wonderful, thank you." Her voice was perfectly steady. Not a single tremor, she surprised herself. "I am already learning how to lie." Tet. Clara walked into the dining room. The long mahogany table was set for 12. Silverware gleamed under the crystal chandelier. White orchids spilled from the centerpieces. It was a picture of absolute perfection. Vance stood at the head of the table. He was 37 years old. He wore his tuxedo like a second skin. He was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Development. He built luxury high-rises. He was charming, magnetic, and ruthlessly ambitious. Right now, he was holding court. He had three major investors, laughing at a joke she had heard a dozen times before. Clara took her seat at the opposite end of the long table. The physical distance between them felt like a canyon. A waiter poured sparkling water into her glass. The ice clinked gently against the crystal. Clink, clink. Vance noticed her sitting down. He smiled. It was his signature smile, the one that made the cover of business magazines. He tapped his silver fork against his champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound brought the room to a halt. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vance said. His voice was a rich baritone. It carried effortlessly across the room. "Before we begin this incredible meal, I want to propose a toast." The investors raised their glasses. Their wives smiled politely. Vance turned his body toward Clara. He raised his crystal flute to "My beautiful wife, Clara," he said. "For 7 years, she has been my anchor. When I started this company, she was the one who believed in me. She gave up her own career in finance to support mine, and now she is giving me the greatest gift of all." He gestured gracefully toward her stomach. The guests offered a collective, warm murmur. To Clara, Vance continued, "The mother of my future daughter, the heart of this home, I am nothing without you." To Clara, the guests echoed. They drank. Vance smiled at the room. The guests clapped lightly. It was a beautiful speech. It was the kind of speech a devoted husband makes. But Clara noticed something terrifying. While he spoke those beautiful words, his eyes never actually met hers. He looked at her forehead. He looked at her shoulder. He looked at the investors to gauge their reaction. He was performing. He was delivering a pitch. He needed these men to see him as a stable, loving family man. It was good for the company's stock. Clara picked up her water glass. Her hand trembled slightly. She placed her index finger against the cool crystal. She tapped it. Tap, tap, tap. She needed the physical sensation to ground herself. "He is not talking to me. I am just a prop on his stage. A very expensive pregnant prop." Dinner was a blur. Clara ate nothing. She pushed the roasted lamb around her gold-rimmed plate. She smiled when spoken to. She nodded at the right times. She discussed the private school waitlists and the upcoming charity gala. All the while, the piece of paper burned in her pocket. $45,000. A teardrop diamond. Who was she? Was she tall? Was she young? Did she know about Clara? Did she know about the baby? Clara watched Vance from across the table. He was leaning in, listening to an older investor discuss interest rates. Vance nodded, taking a slow sip of his red wine. He looked completely relaxed. He looked like a man with no secrets. That was the most terrifying part. His ability to compartmentalize. If he could lie about something this massive without a single drop of sweat, what else was he lying about? The dinner concluded. The guests moved to the living room for coffee and aged scotch. Clara excused herself to the hallway. The air here was quiet. At the end of the long corridor stood an antique grandfather clock. It was a wedding gift from Vance's parents. The heavy brass pendulum swung back and forth. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound was usually comforting. Tonight, it sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. It sounded like a countdown. Time was running out on her perfect life. Clara leaned against the cool wall. She closed her eyes. The exhaustion of the second trimester washed over her in a heavy wave. Her lower back ached. Her feet were swollen in her designer heels. Footsteps approached on the hardwood floor. Slow, confident. She opened her eyes. Vance was walking toward her. He had a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand. "You are quiet tonight," he said. His tone was casual. He stopped right in front of her. "I am just tired, Vance," Clara said. Her voice was flat. "The baby is heavy today." Vance reached out. He placed a hand on her pregnant stomach. It was a gesture that should have brought comfort. Instead, Clara's skin crawled. She wanted to slap his hand away. She kept her arms firmly at her sides. "You did wonderfully," Vance said. Richard loved the lamb. "I think he is going to sign the new development deal." By Friday, he leaned down. He kissed her on the cheek. Clara froze. As his face brushed past hers, she breathed in. Underneath the sharp scent of his expensive scotch, there was something else. A very faint, lingering perfume clinging to his collar. It was sweet, warm, vanilla, and amber. Clara did not wear vanilla. She wore crisp citrus bergamot. She had worn the same perfume since they met in college. Vance pulled back. He smiled. "Go to bed, Clara. You look pale. I will see the guests out." He turned and walked back toward the living room. He did not look back. Clara stood frozen in the hallway. The pendulum swung. Tick-tock. I am not crazy. I know what I found. I know what I smell. She walked slowly to the master bedroom. She closed the heavy mahogany door. The lock clicked into place with a sharp snap. She walked into the bathroom. She turned on the cold water. She splashed it over her face, ruining her perfect makeup. She grabbed a thick white towel and pressed it against her eyes. She looked at herself in the massive vanity mirror. Her blonde hair was pinned up perfectly. Her diamond earrings sparkled. She looked like the luckiest woman in the city. She looked like a woman who had everything. The reflection was a lie. Clara walked back into the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the king-size bed. She pulled the receipt from her pocket. She smoothed out the wrinkles on her lap. She read the address of the jewelry store. She read the date again. She thought about the past 2 weeks. Vance had been working late. He had taken 2 sudden overnight trips for site inspections. He had been overly attentive when he was home. Buying her flowers, ordering her favorite takeout. It was not affection. It was guilt. Or worse, it was management. He was managing her. Clara lay back on the pillows. She placed her hands protectively over her stomach. The baby shifted, pressing against her ribs. Her life had been a brilliant, endless summer. They had built Vanguard Development together from a tiny 2-room office. She had run the numbers. She had secured their first loan. When the company took off, Vance asked her to step down. He said he wanted her to rest. He said he wanted her to prepare for a family. She had trusted him. Trust. She had handed over the keys to the empire they built together. She had happily stepped into the role of the supportive wife. And now, he was buying teardrop diamonds for a ghost who smelled like vanilla. 2 hours later, the penthouse was entirely silent. The guests were gone. The bedroom door opened softly. Vance walked in. He moved quietly in the dark. He took off his tuxedo. He climbed into bed beside her. Clara kept her breathing slow and even in-out, in-out. She pretended to be in a deep, dreamless sleep. Vance did not touch her. He turned on his side, facing away from her. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into sleep. Clara opened her eyes in the dark. She stared at the ceiling. Panic tried to claw its way up her throat. If he was having an affair, what did that mean for her? She had no income of her own right now. Her name was only on the joint checking account, not the corporate holdings. She was pregnant, vulnerable, dependent. If she screamed right now, if she woke him up and threw the receipt in his face, he would deny it. He was a master negotiator. He would say it was a gift for a client. He would gaslight her. He would tell her the pregnancy hormones were making her paranoid. And then he would hide everything else. No, she could not confront him. Not yet. The brilliant summer of her marriage was over. The leaves were already turning brown. A cold wind was blowing through the glass walls of the penthouse. Clara wiped a single hot tear from her cheek. It was the only tear she would allow herself to shed tonight. I built you. Vance, I know exactly how your foundation is poured. And tomorrow, I will start inspecting the cracks. She closed her eyes. The grandfather clock chimed midnight in the distance. The longest game of her life had just begun. She lay there for another hour, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. It was steady. It was the breathing of a man without a conscience. Clara carefully slid out of the bed. She placed her bare feet on the cold hardwood floor. She didn't put on her slippers. She wanted the cold to keep her awake. She walked out of the bedroom, moving silently like a ghost in her own home. She walked past the nursery. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. Moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating the room. It was painted a soft, neutral cream. A custom-made oak crib stood against the far wall. Expensive stuffed animals sat perfectly arranged on a white shelf. A plush rocking chair sat in the corner. It was a room waiting for a miracle. Now it felt like a room waiting for a disaster. Clara walked over to the crib. She rested her hands on the smooth wooden railing. She thought about the woman she used to be, the financial analyst who could spot a hidden asset buried in a 100-page ledger. The woman who never backed down from a tough negotiation. Where had she gone? She had let herself become soft. She had let the luxury dull her instincts. But as she stood in the moonlight, feeling the child move inside her, the softness began to evaporate. It was replaced by something cold, something hard and unbreakable, a mother's instinct to protect her young. Vance thought she was just a pregnant wife. He thought she was safely tucked away in this penthouse, ignorant of the world outside. He had forgotten who she used to be. He had made a fatal miscalculation. Clara turned away from the crib. She walked to the large window and looked out over the glowing city. The streetlights stretched out like a grid of golden veins. Down there somewhere was the jewelry store. Somewhere out there was a woman wearing a teardrop diamond. Tomorrow, Clara would check the joint bank accounts. She would check the credit card statements. She knew Vance was too smart to leave a paper trail there. He would have used a private account. But every account leaves a shadow, and Clara knew how to hunt for shadows. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sun would come up in 5 hours. When it did, Clara would put her mask back on. She would be the glowing, happy, pregnant wife. She would kiss her husband. She would ask him about his day. She would smile. She would smile until her jaw ached. And behind that smile, she would start building her case. Brick by brick, document by document, she reached into her pocket. One last time, she touched the folded receipt. It didn't burn anymore. Now, it felt like a weapon. I am not the victim in this story. I am the architect of my own survival. Clara walked out of the nursery. She pulled the door gently shut behind her. The click of the latch echoed in the silent hallway. The first autumn rain was coming, and Clara was going to be ready for the storm. The morning arrived with a heavy, relentless gray. Clara stood in the kitchen of the penthouse. She held a ceramic mug with both hands, absorbing its fading heat. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the first major storm of autumn was battering the city. Rain lashed violently against the thick glass, blurring the skyline into a smudge of steel and charcoal. Behind her, the expensive espresso machine hummed. The smell of fresh French roast coffee filled the room. Usually, it was a scent she loved. But this morning it had sat on the warmer for too long. The smell was turning acrid. It smelled bitter, like everything else that morning. Vance walked into the kitchen. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, looking as crisp and energetic as if he had slept for 10 hours. He was knotting a silk tie. "Good morning, beautiful," Vance said. His voice was bright, too bright. "Stan." "Morning," Clara answered. Her voice was flat, blending into the sound of the rain. He walked over and kissed her forehead. He smelled of peppermint toothpaste and expensive sandalwood cologne. There was no trace of the vanilla perfume from the night before. He had showered. He had erased the evidence. Vance moved to the marble island. He set his phone down next to the fruit bowl. Clara watched it. For 7 years, Vance had always left his phone face up. He received hundreds of emails a day. He liked to see the notifications light up the screen. It was a habit of a man who needed to feel important, a man who had nothing to hide. This morning, he placed the phone face down. It was a small detail, a microscopic shift in routine. But to a former financial analyst, small deviations in a pattern were the loudest alarms. Vance reached for a glass of water. As he drank, a text message buzzed against the marble. The phone vibrated violently. Vance set his glass down a fraction too quickly. He picked up the device, turning his back to Clara. Clara watched his thumb move across the screen. Up left, down right. He was typing a passcode. Clara frowned, hiding her face behind her coffee mug. Vance did not use a passcode. He had always used facial recognition, or the simple 4-digit PIN of their anniversary date. He had complained loudly for years that complex passwords slowed him down. Now, he was carefully swiping a complex geometric pattern. "Everything all right at the office?" Clara asked. She kept her tone light, casual. Vance slipped the phone into his inner jacket pocket without looking at her. "Just a minor delay with the steel suppliers for the downtown project. Nothing I cannot handle." He checked his gold watch. "I have a breakfast meeting in 20 minutes. I will probably be late tonight. The board wants to review the quarterly projections." "Of course," Clara said. He grabbed his leather briefcase. "Do not wait up for me. Get some rest. You look exhausted." I will, Clara said. The heavy front door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place with a sharp metallic thud. Clara was completely alone. The silence of the massive apartment rushed in, broken only by the aggressive beating of the rain against the glass. She walked over to the sofa and sat down. She pulled her own phone from her maternity pocket. Her fingers were trembling. She opened the family tracking application. Vance had insisted on installing it when she got pregnant, claiming he needed to know she was safe at all times. Clara stared at the screen. She dragged her thumb down to refresh the map. Loading, she locked the screen, unlocked it, opened the app again, dragged her thumb down, loading. She closed the application entirely. She took a breath. She opened it a third time, three times. Swipe up, close, open, refresh. A small gray banner appeared beneath Vance's name. Location paused. Clara let the phone drop into her lap. She leaned her head back against the cold leather of the sofa. A nameless, suffocating anxiety pressed against her chest. She wanted to scream. She wanted to call him and demand to know why his location was hidden. She wanted to ask who had texted him at 7 in the morning. But a deeper, older part of her brain took over. The part that used to sit in boardrooms and dissect hostile corporate takeovers. If you ask a question without having the proof, you give the enemy a chance to build a better lie. At 9:30 in the morning, the digital chime of the private elevator rang through the penthouse. Clara walked to the foyer. The stainless steel doors part hard. Maeve stepped out. Maeve was 32 years old, with sharp features and a fierce, protective energy. She had been Clara's best friend since middle school. She wore heavy rain boots and a bright yellow trench coat, holding a dripping umbrella. She brought chaos and reality into the sterile, perfectly curated penthouse. "It is a literal hurricane out there," Maeve announced. She kicked off her boots on the entry mat and handed her wet coat to Clara's housekeeper, who had just arrived. "I brought the bagels you asked for, and do not tell me you are not hungry. I am feeding my goddaughter, not you." Clara managed a genuine, albeit tired smile. "Thank you, Maeve." They walked into the kitchen. Maeve took one sniff of the air and grimaced. She walked straight to the coffee machine, dumped the bitter carafe into the sink, and turned on the electric kettle for tea. "So," Maeve said, leaning against the counter, "how was the grand performance last night? Did the investors eat out of Vance's hand like usual?" "They did," Clara said. She sat on a velvet bar stool, pulling a plain bagel from the paper bag. "He gave a beautiful speech. We secured the funding." Maeve rolled her eyes affectionately. "Of course he did. Vance could sell sand in a desert. I am just glad it is over so you can actually rest." "You look pale, Clara. Are you sleeping?" "Not really. The baby kicks all night." It was a partial truth, the easiest kind of lie. Maeve brought over 2 steaming mugs of peppermint tea. She sat across from Clara at the marble island. "Well, he owes you a vacation before the baby comes," Maeve said, blowing on her tea. "Speaking of Vance, I meant to text you yesterday. Is Vanguard expanding into residential properties on the west side?" Clara stopped chewing. The bagel suddenly tasted like dry ash in her mouth. She forced herself to swallow. "No, Vanguard only builds commercial high-rises." "Why?" Maeve shrugged, taking a sip of her tea. "Oh, I must have been mistaken then. I had a client meeting in the West Side yesterday afternoon. I could have sworn I saw Vance's car parked outside the Orient Towers, the new luxury condominium complex on 43rd Street, the one with the private security gates." Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. Vance drove a custom, charcoal gray, imported sports car. There were only 3 of them in the entire city. Maeve was not mistaken, Clara asked. Her voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. "Pretty sure," Maeve said casually. "I only noticed because he was parked right next to the fire hydrant. I thought to myself, only Vance would risk a $300 ticket because he didn't want to walk an extra block in the rain. I figured he was scouting the building to buy out the developers." "Right," Clara said slowly. She picked up her tea mug to hide her shaking hands. "Yes, he did mention something about looking at a new investment property. I forgot." "Well, tell him to be careful." Maeve laughed. "The Orient Towers are strictly residential. They don't take kindly to corporate sharks sniffing around." Maeve moved the conversation onto her own work drama. Clara nodded. She made affirmative noises. She smiled at the right times, but she was not listening. Her mind was racing, connecting invisible dots on a dark map. A $45,000 diamond necklace, the faint smell of vanilla perfume, a changed phone password, location tracking paused. His custom car parked outside an exclusive residential building. On the other side of the city, the pieces were falling into place. It was not a sudden explosive shock. It was a slow, agonizing realization. A dull, lingering ache that settled deep into her bones. He is hiding a woman, and he is hiding her at the Orion Towers. Clara looked at Maeve. A desperate urge washed over her to tell her best friend everything, to cry, to collapse onto the kitchen counter and let Maeve hold her. But she couldn't, not yet. If she said the words out loud, it became real. If she told Maeve, Maeve would storm down to Vanguard headquarters and throw a chair through Vance's glass office door. Maeve would start a war, and Clara was in no position to fight a war right now. She had no ammunition. She only had suspicions. I have to use the restroom, Clara interrupted softly. She stood up from the stool. She walked down the long hallway to the master bathroom. She shut the door and locked it. She turned on the sink faucet, letting the water run loud enough to drown out any sound. She gripped the edges of the marble vanity. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was drawn. Her eyes were wide, with a terror she could no longer deny. Just, for the past 12 hours, a tiny foolish part of her had tried to explain away the receipt. She had tried to persuade herself that it was just her imagination, that pregnancy hormones were making her paranoid, that she was looking for problems where none existed. But the fantasy was over. She closed her eyes. The image of the diamond receipt flashed in her mind. Then the image of the paused location screen. Then the image of the Orion Towers. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She opened her eyes and stared directly into her own reflection. I am not crazy. I know what I saw. I am not imagining this. My gut is trying to save me. She turned off the faucet. The bathroom plunged into silence, save for the muffled sound of the autumn rain outside. Clara wiped a stray drop of water from the marble counter. Her movements were slow, deliberate. The panic was receding, leaving behind a cold, calculating clarity. She did not know who the woman was. She did not know what apartment she lived in, but she knew where to start looking. Just, she unlocked the bathroom door and walked back out to the kitchen, carrying the weight of a dying marriage in silence. Maeve left the penthouse just before noon. She hugged Clara tightly, promising to call later. The heavy front door clicked shut, the deadbolt engaged. Clara was alone again. The rain continued to assault the glass windows. She walked down the long corridor toward the west wing of the apartment. She stopped in front of Vance's home office. The door was solid mahogany. It was always locked. Vance had installed a biometric fingerprint scanner 2 years ago, claiming he needed maximum security for sensitive corporate blueprints. But Clara knew her husband. She knew his arrogance. He always believed he was the smartest person in the room. He believed a digital lock was foolproof, but he also hated being inconvenienced if the power went out. Clara walked to the antique console table a few feet away. A heavy bronze statue of a rearing horse sat in the center. Clara gripped the base of the statue. She lifted it. Underneath, hidden in a small hollow cavity, was a heavy brass skeleton key. The metal felt ice cold against her palm. She slid the key into the manual override slot beneath the scanner. The lock disengaged with a heavy, satisfying click. Clara pushed the door open. The room was dark. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight. The air smelled of aged paper, expensive leather polish, and the sharp, lingering scent of Vance cologne. She did not turn on the main overhead light. She clicked on the small green desk lamp to cast a narrow pool of light across the pristine mahogany desk. Vance's primary laptop was with him at the office. But Clara was not looking for his primary device. She walked around the desk and opened the bottom right drawer. Just beneath a stack of old architectural magazines sat his secondary laptop. It was a sleek silver machine he used for archived files. He thought she had forgotten it existed. Clara placed the laptop on the desk. She opened the lid. The cooling fan whirred softly to life. The screen illuminated her face. A password prompt appeared. It would not be his anniversary. It would not be his mother's maiden name. Clara closed her eyes. She thought like an analyst. She thought like Vance. What does a narcissist use to secure his deepest secrets? She typed the incorporation date of Vanguard Development, followed by his own birth year. Access granted. The desktop materialized. Clara's breathing was slow and measured. She opened the file manager. Her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. She bypassed the standard document folders and navigated straight to a partitioned, encrypted drive. It required a secondary PIN. She typed the street address of his childhood home. The drive unlocked. Dozens of folders appeared. Most were labeled with boring, mundane titles. Tax 2023 point zoning permits. Clara ignored them. She used the search bar. She typed a single word Orion. The system searched. The loading icon spun. Then a single PDF document appeared on the screen. The file name was Lease Agreement 43.pdf. Clara double-clicked it. The document opened. It was a standard luxury residential lease for a penthouse unit at the Orion Towers. The rent was $22,000 a month. It was paid in full, 2 years in advance. Paid via a shell that Clara instantly recognized as one of Vanguard's subsidiary companies. She scrolled down to the signature line. She expected to see a stranger's name. She expected to see a ghost. Instead, she saw a name she knew intimately. Juliet Montgomery. Clara stared at the glowing letters. The name echoed in her head, Juliet. The 28-year-old director of public relations for Vanguard Development, the woman with the bright smile and the flawless blowout, the woman who had attended Clara's baby shower 3 months ago. Juliet, who had handed Clara a silver rattle, touched her pregnant stomach and said, "You two are going to be such wonderful parents." The nausea hit Clara so hard she had to grip the edge of the desk. The betrayal was no longer faceless. It had a voice. It had a smile. It was happening right in front of her, in the middle of her own company. I was completely blind. They were laughing at me the entire time. Clara forced herself to swallow the bile rising in her throat. The romantic betrayal was devastating. But Clara was an analyst. She knew that men like Vance did not just hide affairs. They hid money. She closed the lease agreement. She went back to the hidden drive. She scrolled past the property files and found a folder labeled Personal Restructuring. She opened it. Inside was a draft document prepared by a boutique law firm that Vanguard had never used before. The file was titled Founders Equity Revision, Draft V4.pdf. Clara opened the document. Her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. She read the clauses. She read the stipulations. The truth was more devastating than she had imagined. It was a post-nuptial agreement, disguised as a routine wealth management update. 7 years ago, Clara had drafted the original founding patents and corporate structure for Vanguard. She owned 50% of the intellectual property. Vance owned the operational side. It was a brilliant, equal partnership. This new document was designed to sever that partnership. Buried on page 42 was a restructuring clause. If Clara signed it, she would unknowingly transfer her entire intellectual property rights into Vance's sole holding company. Her founding shares would be diluted to zero. She would be completely erased from the empire she helped build. Clara checked the timeline at the top of the draft. The execution date was set for next month, exactly 4 weeks before her due date. He was going to frame it as a standard hospital preparation document. He was going to slide it in front of her while she was exhausted, heavy, and trusting. He was going to steal her life's work right before she gave birth to his child, ensuring that if they divorced later, she would walk away with nothing but a standard alimony check. He is not just leaving me. He is destroying me. Clara did not cry. The dull, lingering ache in her chest instantly froze into something absolute and terrifying. The tears evaporated. Her hands stopped shaking. She pulled a tiny silver USB drive from her pocket. She plugged it into the laptop. She dragged the lease agreement and the legal drafts onto the drive. She watched the green progress bar slide across the screen. Transfer complete. She ejected the drive. She deleted her search history. She powered down the laptop. The screen went black, plunging the room back into shadows. She placed the machine exactly where she found it. She wiped the desk with her sleeve to remove any fingerprints. She walked out of the office. She locked the heavy mahogany door. She placed the cold brass key back beneath the bronze horse. Clara walked down the hallway. She did not go to the kitchen. She did not go to the master bedroom. She walked straight to the nursery. She opened the door. The room was gray and shadowed from the storm outside. Dust. Clara walked to the center of the soft carpet. She sank to her knees. Her pregnant belly made the movement clumsy, but she did not care. She reached out and pulled a folded yellow baby blanket from the bottom shelf of the bookcase. She placed it on her lap. She unfolded the soft fabric. It was completely silent in the room. The only sound was the distant, muffled beating of the rain against the penthouse glass. Clara took the top corners of the blanket. She folded it in half. She matched the edges perfectly. Then she folded it into quarters. She smoothed her hands over the soft yellow cotton. She unfolded it entirely. She folded it in half again. Then quarters, she sat on the floor, tussed, folding and unfolding the blanket in absolute deafening silence. She did this for 4 minutes. Her mind was entirely blank. She needed the repetition. She needed the physical texture of the fabric. She needed the rhythm to keep her heart from exploding. When the 4 minutes were over, she placed the perfectly folded square back on the shelf. Clara stood up. She touched her stomach. The baby was quiet now. "We are going to be fine," Clara whispered to the empty room. "He thinks he has already won, but he just gave me the blueprints to his own destruction." The next afternoon, the penthouse was suffocatingly bright. The storm had passed, leaving a mocking, brilliant sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The digital chime of the private elevator rang through the foyer. Clara took a deep breath, pasting on her most radiant smile. Patricia walked in. She was 35 years old, the wife of Vance's lead architectural director. She wore a flawless beige cashmere sweater and carried a massive crystal vase filled with white lilies. "Clara, darling, you look absolutely glowing," Patricia chimed, kissing the air near Clara's cheeks. The smell of the lilies hit Clara instantly. It was sickeningly sweet, overpowering. It smelled like a funeral parlor hiding a decaying secret. Clara subtly stepped back, fighting the urge to push the vase away. "Thank you, Patricia. They are beautiful," Clara said. Her voice was perfectly tuned, light, grateful. They moved to the living room. The housekeeper poured them sparkling water with lemon. The ice clinked sharply against the thin glass. Clink, clink. Clara played her part flawlessly. She discussed the baby nursery paint colors. She listened to Patricia complain about her country club membership fees. Clara smiled. She nodded. She offered warm, meaningless platitudes. Then, Patricia set her glass down on the glass coffee table. "I was looking at the guest list for the hospital charity. Gala next month," Patricia said casually. "Are you still planning to wear that stunning red silk maternity dress?" "I only ask because Juliet mentioned she was looking for a red gown, and we certainly cannot have the two of you clashing in the event photos." Clara stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. "Juliet?" Clara asked. She kept her tone mild, almost bored. "When did you speak with Juliet about her gala dress?" Patricia's eyes darted away. A micro-expression of sheer panic crossed her perfectly botoxed face. Her hand fluttered nervously to her pearl necklace. "Oh, just, around the office," Patricia stammered. "Vance hosted a brief cocktail gathering for the architectural team last week. Juliet was there. It was nothing, just passing conversation." Clara looked at Patricia, really looked at her. She saw the guilt swimming in the other woman's eyes. Patricia was a terrible liar. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow to the chest. They all know. The entire social circle knows about Juliet. They have been drinking my wine, eating my food, and smiling at me while whispering behind my back. Stop. I am the punchline to a joke I did not know was being told. The anger inside Clara did not explode. It flash froze. It turned into pure crystalline determination. Clara smiled harder. Her jaw physically ached from the effort. "I will wear navy blue, Patricia. Blue is Vance's favorite color. Anyway," Patricia exhaled a loud sigh of relief. "Oh, wonderful. That will be perfect." 2 hours later, Clara left the penthouse. She told her private driver she had an exclusive prenatal yoga session on the Upper East Side. She had him drop her off at the studio doors. She waited until the black car turned the corner. Just. Then Clara walked 2 blocks in the opposite direction. She slipped into an unassuming, ivy-covered brick building. The office of Harrison Caldwell was lined with dark mahogany and heavy leather-bound law books. Harrison was 58 years old. He had silver hair, sharp, predatory eyes, and a reputation for being ruthless. He was a veteran corporate litigator. He had crossed swords with Vance in a real estate dispute 5 years ago. Harrison despised Vance's business practices. That made him the perfect ally. Clara sat across from his massive desk. The heavy leather chair creaked softly in the quiet room. She reached into her designer handbag and placed the tiny silver USB drive on his green desk blotter. "My husband is having an affair," Clara said. Her voice was completely devoid of emotion. "Stan, he has instructed a boutique firm to draft a post-nuptial agreement. He plans to trick me into signing away my founding equity in Vanguard Development before I give birth." Harrison raised a single silver eyebrow. He did not offer pity. He plugged the drive into his secure laptop. He opened the files. The room fell into a heavy silence. The only sound was the rhythmic scratch of Harrison's fountain pen against his yellow legal pad as he took notes. "Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. This postnuptial draft is highly aggressive," Harrison finally said. He leaned back, tapping the fountain pen against his chin. "If you sign this, you unknowingly transfer all of your intellectual property rights into a holding company solely owned by him. You would leave this marriage with nothing but a standard, heavily capped alimony payout. He is also using a dummy subsidiary corporation to pay for a penthouse lease at the Orion Towers. Vance is arrogant, Clara, but this is incredibly sloppy. I need a divorce," Clara said, "but I cannot confront him today. If I do, he will freeze our joint accounts. He will lock me out of the company servers. He will tie me up in litigation for a decade." Harrison looked at her over his reading glasses. "He thinks you are just going to sign this paper when he presents it. He thinks I am a naive, exhausted, pregnant housewife who does not understand complex legal restructuring," Clara answered. Harrison smiled. It was a dangerous, approving smile. "What exactly do you want to do, Clara?" "I built him," Clara declared. "And somewhere along the way, I became invisible to him. I want my half of the empire. I want full physical custody of my daughter. And I want him to watch his perfect world dismantle piece by piece. Then we need the original patents. You drafted 7 years ago," Harrison said. "We need to build the legal cage in absolute silence. And when he steps inside, we lock the door." Clara returned to the penthouse at 5 in the evening. Adrenaline was coursing through her veins like hot battery acid. Her mind was racing with legal strategies, subsidiary names, and patent dates. She could not sit still. The silence of the apartment was driving her insane. She walked into the pristine kitchen. She bypassed the refrigerator entirely. She opened the low cabinet beneath the sink. She pulled out a heavy bottle of industrial bleach and an old scrubbing toothbrush. Clara dropped to her knees on the hard ceramic tile floor. Her pregnant belly pressed uncomfortably against her thighs. She sprayed the bleach directly onto the white grout lines between the tiles. The sharp, toxic chemical smell instantly burned the air, overpowering the lingering ghost of Patricia's sickening lilies. Clara began to scrub. Back and forth. Back and forth, she scrubbed the grout until her knuckles turned white. She scrubbed until her shoulder muscles burned with exhaustion. She focused intensely on a single tiny stain on the floor. She scrubbed to burn off the rage. She scrubbed so she would not scream when Vance walked through the front door. She stayed on the floor for 20 minutes, scrubbing away invisible dirt, preparing herself for a war no one knew was coming. The click of the safety deposit box echoed in the silent bank vault. Click, clack, Clara pulled out the long metal tray. The air inside the private viewing room was freezing, smelling heavily of polished steel and old dust. Inside the box rested a stack of aged, thick parchment paper. These were the original incorporation documents for Vanguard Development. She had drafted them 7 years ago. They clearly outlined her 50% ownership of the foundational patents. She placed the documents into a leather folio. She walked out of the bank and straight to Harrison S. office. Harrison reviewed the papers behind his massive mahogany desk. He traced the signatures with his silver pen. "These are ironclad," Harrison confirmed. His voice held a sharp edge of triumph. Your original patents are still completely valid, Clara. He never legally dissolved this initial partnership. He just buried it under layers of new corporate shells. Clara nodded slowly. And the trap document he wants me to sign? Harrison slid a thin manila folder across the desk. I recreated the middle section of his postnuptial agreement. The font, the margins, the paper weight, everything is identical. But I changed the legal phrasing on page 42. Instead of forfeiting your equity, this new clause legally binds your 50% ownership to any and all of his future holdings. If he signs this, he is officially locking himself into a cage. Clara took the folder. Her hands were perfectly steady. When will he present it? Harrison asked. Soon, Clara answered. He is running out of time before the baby arrives. She did not have to wait long. Thursday evening, Clara stepped out of the private elevator into the penthouse. The air felt unnaturally still. Vance was sitting in the living room. He was not alone. A thin, nervous woman in a gray suit sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, clutching a brass stamp, a notary public. Vance stood up. He smiled warmly, but his eyes were entirely cold. He smelled of strong peppermint and expensive leather. Clara, darling, Vance said. I am glad you are home. This is Miss Albright. She is here to notarize a quick wealth management update for the company. He gestured to a thick, black leather binder resting on the glass coffee table. Clara looked at the binder. The trap was set. A wealth management update? Clara asked. She kept her voice light, innocent. Do we need to do this right now? My lower back is absolutely killing me today. It will only take 2 minutes, Vance said smoothly. He walked over and placed a hand on the small of her back. It felt like a heavy weight pressing her down. Just standard restructuring. I want to make sure you and the baby are perfectly protected before you go into labor. You just need to sign the last page. He was pushing. He wanted it done before she had time to think. Clara looked at the notary. Then she looked at Vance. I am not your victim. I am the architect of your ruin, all right, Clara said softly. But I need to sit in a proper to read it. The sofa hurts my back. I will look at it at my desk. Vance frowned slightly. The micro-expression of annoyance flashed across his face, but he could not argue with his heavily pregnant wife in front of a stranger. Of course, Vance said. Take your time. Clara picked up the heavy black binder. She walked slowly down the hallway to the small alcove desk she used for writing thank you notes. She sat down. She was out of their direct line of sight, but she could still hear Vance pouring a glass of sparkling water for the notary. She had exactly 2 minutes. Clara opened the binder. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, but her hands moved with surgical precision. She reached into the deep pocket of her maternity cardigan. She pulled out the folded pages Harrison had given her. She opened the metal rings of the binder. Snap, snap, snap. The sound seemed deafening to her ears. She waited for Vance to walk around the corner. He did not. Clara pulled out pages 40 through 45 of Vance Trap. She slid them down into her pocket. She took Harrison's replacement pages and placed them onto the metal rings. She closed the rings. Snap. She flipped to the signature page at the very end. She picked up a black fountain pen from the desk. She took one deep, steadying breath. I deserve better than this. I am taking back my life. She walked back into the living room, carrying the closed binder. She placed it on the glass table. It looks a bit complicated, but I trust you, Vance, Clara said. Her voice was the picture of sweet, naive devotion. Vance smiled. It was a smile of pure arrogance. He believed he had won. Thank you, Clara, he said. Clara signed her name on the final page. The pen scratched loudly against the thick paper. Vance took the pen from her hand. He signed his name right next to hers. He did not flip back to check the middle pages. He was too eager to close the trap. Miss Albright stamped the page. The heavy brass thudded against the glass table. Thud. It was done. The document was legally binding. Vance thought he had just stolen her entire net worth. He had no idea he had just handed her half of his billion-dollar empire. Vance thanked the notary and walked her to the elevator. Clara stood in the center of the living room. Adrenaline crashed through her system in a violent, exhausting wave. Her knees felt weak. The air in the penthouse suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The next morning, before the sun even crested the horizon, Clara left the apartment. She drove her car out of the city, heading east toward the coastline. She parked the car on a deserted stretch of beach. The sky was a bruised dark purple. The air was freezing. Clara did not get out of the car. She turned off the engine. She rolled down the window just an inch. She sat in the driver's seat, completely motionless. She closed her eyes. The sound of the ocean filled the small space. Crash, retreat, crash, retreat. The rhythmic, heavy sound of the freezing waves hitting the sand. The salty, bitter smell of the sea air cut through the sterile leather scent of the car interior. She sat there in absolute silence for 4 entire minutes. She did not look at her phone. She did not plan her next move. She just sat in the parked car, listening to the vast, indifferent ocean and focused entirely on the steady rhythm of her own breathing. In, out, in, out. The worst part was over. The trap was locked. Now, she just had to survive the coming winter. It was late January. Clara was exactly 8 months pregnant. Outside the glass walls of the penthouse, the city was bracing for a massive blizzard. The sky was the color of bruised iron. The wind howled against the steel frame of the building, a low, menacing moan that rattled the windows. Inside, the temperature was a perfectly controlled 72 degrees. Vance stood in the center of the walk-in closet. He was zipping up a sleek black leather duffel bag. He wore a heavy cashmere sweater and expensive snow boots. "I absolutely hate leaving you right now, Clara," Vance said. He sounded genuinely pained. He was a master of his own script. "But this investor retreat in Aspen is critical. The board insists the chief executive officer be there to present the first quarter projections." Clara stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around her swollen belly. She knew the truth. Harrison's private investigator had confirmed it yesterday. Juliet was also booked on the corporate jet to Aspen. "I understand, Vance," Clara said. Her voice was hollow, stripped of all emotion. "Business comes first." Vance walked over and kissed her cheek. He smelled of peppermint and expensive leather. "The storm is supposed to be bad. Stay inside. Keep the housekeeper here if you need company. I will call you when we land." He walked out of the apartment. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place. Clara was entirely alone. By 6 in the evening, the city was paralyzed. The snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets. The news networks declared a state of emergency. The streets below were empty, buried under a foot of rapidly freezing snow. Clara was sitting in the plush rocking chair in the dark nursery. She was rubbing her lower back. It had been aching all day. She assumed it was just the heavy barometric pressure of the storm. Then, the first contraction hit. It was not a dull ache. It was a vicious, blinding spike of agony that ripped through her lower abdomen. Clara gasped, gripping the wooden arms of the rocking chair so hard her knuckles popped. The pain crested, held for terrifying 10 seconds, and then slowly receded, leaving her gasping for air in the dark. Before she could process what had just happened, she felt a sudden, warm rush of fluid soak through her maternity trousers. Her water had broken. She was exactly 4 weeks early. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She pulled her phone from her pocket with trembling fingers. She dialed Vance's number. The line rang once, twice. Then the automated voice echoed in her ear. "The cellular subscriber you have reached is unavailable. Please leave a message." He had turned his phone off. He was in Aspen. He was sitting in a luxury ski chalet by a roaring fire with Juliet, drinking aged wine and ignoring the world. Clara threw the phone onto the carpet. Another contraction hit. This one was stronger. It doubled her over. She clamped her teeth over her bottom lip to keep from screaming. She could not call an ambulance. The news had just announced that emergency services were completely gridlocked due to the whiteout conditions and dozens of highway pileups. If she waited for an ambulance, she would give birth on the floor of the penthouse. She had to drive herself. Clara forced herself to stand. She ignored the hospital bag packed with silk robes and expensive lotions sitting by the front door. She grabbed her heavy winter coat and the keys to her reinforced all-wheel drive sport utility vehicle. She took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage. The air down here was freezing, smelling of exhaust and damp concrete. She climbed into the driver's seat. Her hands shook violently as she gripped the leather steering wheel. She started the engine. She did not drive toward the elite private maternity ward in the city center. The roads in that direction were completely impassable, blocked by abandoned transit buses. Instead, she turned the heavy vehicle toward the city limits. She headed for St. Jude Medical, a secondary, older hospital on the edge of the industrial district. The drive was a living nightmare. The wind lashed the snow directly into the windshield, defeating the frantic rhythm of the wipers. The streetlights flickered and died, plunging the roads into absolute darkness. Underneath her tires, the snow had compressed into solid black ice. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the frozen pavement. Crunch, slide, crunch. Every 5 minutes, another contraction tore through her body. Clara gripped the steering wheel, screaming into the empty car as she fought to keep the vehicle sliding on the icy road. The physical agony was immense, but the emotional isolation was heavier. She was giving birth to the heir of a billion-dollar empire, completely alone in the freezing dark, while her husband was sleeping with another woman. She finally saw the glowing red emergency sign of St. Jude, medical cutting through the blizzard. Clara abandoned the car directly in front of the sliding glass doors. She stumbled into the bright, chaotic emergency waiting room. A nurse took one look at her soaked clothes and gray face and immediately brought a wheelchair. 10 minutes later, Clara was lying on a stiff, narrow bed in a harsh, fluorescent-lit delivery room. The environment was completely sterile. The sharp, metallic smell of hospital iodine coated the back of her throat, making her nauseous. There was no soft music. There were no expensive aromatherapy candles. There was just the cold reality of a severely understaffed hospital during a natural disaster. A nurse attached a wide belt to Clara's stomach. The machine beside the bed clicked on. The rhythmic beeping of the fetal heart monitor filled the small room. Beep, beep. It was fast. It was strong. Her baby was fighting just as hard as she was. Another massive contraction hit. Clara threw her head back against the thin, scratchy hospital pillow. A primal, agonizing cry ripped from her throat. Her body felt like it was being torn apart from the inside out. The physical pain and the emotional betrayal merged into one massive mountain of ice and fire. She wanted to give up. She wanted to close her eyes and disappear into the dark. But then, the monitor beeped louder. Beep, beep, Clara opened her eyes. She stared at the harsh fluorescent light above her. The tears finally fell, hot and fast, tracking down her pale cheeks. But they were not tears of defeat. They were tears of pure, unadulterated resilience. I am the architect of my own survival. She squeezed her eyes shut and forced the words out into the cold, sterile air. He is gone, Clara whispered, her voice shaking but fiercely absolute. But I am still here. We are going to be fine. The longest winter night had reached its peak, and Clara was not going to break. The blizzard finally broke on Saturday morning. Inside the quiet maternity ward of St. Jude Medical, Clara held her daughter. The baby was small, weighing exactly 5 pounds, but perfectly healthy. The hospital room was entirely silent, save for the soft, metallic humming of the radiator heater beneath the window. Sunlight poured through the frosted glass, casting a pale glow across the linoleum floor. Clara gently traced the tiny, warm fingers of her newborn. The baby smelled like sweet milk and clean cotton. It was a grounding, beautiful scent that overpowered the sharp hospital iodine. 48 hours had passed. Since Clara's terrifying drive through the freezing snow, Vance had not called, not once. Clara did not care. The paralyzing fear of the past few months was completely gone. The winter storm had frozen the last remaining drops of her love for her husband. What was left in its place was pure, unyielding ice. Clara carefully handed the sleeping baby to the night nurse, who had just come in to check her vitals. Clara stood up from the bed. Her body ached with a dull, heavy pain. Her legs trembled slightly, but she forced herself to walk across the room. She walked into the small hospital bathroom. The harsh fluorescent light buzzed loudly above the sink. Buzz! Buzz! Clara stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror. Her skin was incredibly pale, almost translucent. Dark purple circles shadowed her eyes. Her blonde hair was tangled and dull. She looked exactly like a woman who had just survived a brutal war. She opened her small overnight bag on the counter. She pulled out a small tube of tinted cherry lip balm. She uncapped it. She looked at her dry lips in the mirror. She applied the balm to her bottom lip. Slow, deliberate. She pressed her lips together. She applied it to her top lip. She capped the tube. Click. She did not brush her hair. She did not apply concealer. She did not need to look pretty or put together. She was putting on her war paint. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy door to her hospital room flew open. The door hit the wall stopper with a loud, violent thud. Clara did not flinch. She sat perfectly still against the thin hospital pillows. Vance rushed into the room. He was wearing his expensive cashmere coat, but it was heavily wrinkled. His hair was messy. He looked deliberately disheveled. He stopped at the foot of the hospital bed, panting heavily, as if he had just run up 6 flights of stairs. Clara, Vance gasped. He stepped closer to the bed. The smell of him hit her instantly, rolling over her like a suffocating cloud. It was a mixture of stale airport coffee, pine wood smoke, and cold sweat. My God, Clara, I am so sorry, Vance said. His voice trembled perfectly. It was a magnificent, award-winning performance. The storm knocked out all the cell towers in Aspen. The roads were completely buried. We were trapped in the chalet. I just got your voicemails 3 hours ago. I chartered a private helicopter the second the sky cleared. He looked at the small plastic bassinet beside her bed. He reached his hands out, taking another step toward her. Are you all right? Is our baby okay? He asked, his voice thick with fake emotion. Clara did not shrink back. She did not yell. She did not throw her water cup at his head. She looked at him with completely dead, empty eyes. The silence in the room stretched. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to suck the oxygen from the air. Vance slowly lowered his hands. His fake panic began to falter. He shifted his weight nervously from his left foot to his right. He was not used to this version of his wife. He expected tears. He expected a hysterical screaming woman he could easily comfort and manipulate with empty promises. Instead, he was looking at a glacier. Clara? Vance asked. His voice dropped its theatrical pitch. Why are you looking at me like that? Clara reached over to the rolling plastic tray table beside her bed. Next to her untouched plastic cup of apple juice sat a thick brown manila envelope. Harrison had sent his private courier to deliver it exactly 1 hour ago. Clara picked up the heavy envelope. She held it out toward Vance. What is this? Vance asked. He did not reach for it. Take it, Clara said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the warm room like a steel blade. Vance hesitated. Then he reached out and took the envelope. He pulled open the metal clasp. He slid the stack of thick, watermarked legal paper out into his hands. Tuss. His eyes scanned the top page. The bold, black letters at the header were impossible to misunderstand. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Vance stopped breathing. The color completely drained from his handsome face, leaving him looking sickly and gray. Clara, what is this? He demanded. His voice was suddenly sharp, laced with defensive anger. Is this a joke? You just gave birth. Your pregnancy hormones are making you crazy. You are not thinking clearly. Page 4. Vance, Clara said flatly. Vance flipped the pages rapidly. The heavy paper rustled loudly in the quiet room. Rustle, rustle. You will see my signature at the bottom, Clara said. It is already notarized. Harrison Caldwell officially filed it with the state Supreme Court at 9 o'clock this morning. We are getting divorced. Vance let out a sharp, ugly laugh. He tossed the papers onto the foot of her bed. You cannot be serious. Vance sneered. His charming mask completely dissolved, revealing the arrogant predator underneath. You have no money, Clara. You have no job. You are sitting in a secondary public hospital wearing a paper gown. If you try to push this forward, I will bury you in court. You will walk away with absolutely nothing. Clara leaned forward slightly. She did not break eye contact. She let his threats hang in the air for a long moment. You smell like wood smoke. Vance, Clara stated calmly. And you smell like vanilla. Vance froze. The arrogant sneer vanished from his lips instantly. I know about Juliet, Clara continued. Her tone remained completely level, devoid of any tears or heartbreak. I know about the penthouse lease at the Orient Towers. I know. About the $40,000 teardrop diamond pendant you bought her for our 7th anniversary. The terrifying silence returned. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to amplify, beating like a drum in the small room. Tick, tock, tick. tick. Vance opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in 7 years, the brilliant, silver-tongued chief executive officer was completely speechless. He stared at the woman sitting in the hospital bed. He suddenly realized he did not know her at all. Clara settled her back against the pillows. I am not the woman he thought he could easily break. I am the woman who is going to break him. You can leave now, Clara said. Clara, wait. Let us just talk about this rationally, Vance stammered. He took a desperate step forward, his hands raised in surrender. Leave, Clara repeated. Her voice dropped an octave, freezing the very air between them. Or I will press the nurse call button and have hospital security drag you out of this room. Vance stared at her. His chest heaved rapidly. He looked down at the divorce papers resting on the white blanket, then back up at her cold, unyielding face. He slowly backed away toward the door. He turned and walked out. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. Clara let out a long, slow breath. Just. The suffocating weight she had carried for months finally lifted from her shoulders. She looked over at the small bassinet. She smiled. 3 weeks had passed since the terrifying night of the snowstorm. Clara had physically healed. Her daughter was thriving, and the final piece of the trap was ready to spring. Clara stood in the ground floor lobby of Vanguard headquarters. The building was a towering monument of glass and steel. It was the physical manifestation of her husband's massive ego. She had not stepped foot inside this building in 3 years. She walked toward the private executive elevator. Harrison Caldwell walked calmly beside her. He carried two massive black leather binders. Clara was dressed for a funeral. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit. It was sharp, it was unforgiving, it was armor. They stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing them inside the quiet steel box. The machine hummed smoothly as it began its rapid ascent to the 60th floor. Hum, hum. Clara looked at her reflection in the polished mirrored doors. She looked pale, but her eyes were entirely clear. She reached up to the deep navy silk scarf tied around her neck. She frowned. She untied the knot. She carefully tied it again. It did not feel right. She untied it a second time. She looped the silk over her fingers and pulled it tight. Still wrong. She untied it a third time. She tied it again. She untied it a fourth time, her fingers moving in a rapid, nervous rhythm. Before finally securing the knot perfectly against her collar, Harrison watched her quietly. He did not speak. He understood the need for a physical distraction. Ding! The elevator arrived at the 60th floor. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Vance had called an emergency board meeting. Over the past 3 weeks, he had completely ignored Clara's silence. He had frozen their joint bank accounts. He had canceled her credit cards. He had sent her a heavily worded legal letter, offering a pitiful $200,000 settlement and threatening to drag the custody battle out for a decade if she refused. Today, cons. Vance was using this executive board meeting to legally separate his personal assets from Vanguard Development. He was attempting to build a firewall between his wealth and the divorce proceedings. He thought he was invincible. He thought he was brilliant. Fantastic. Clara walked down the thick carpeted hallway. She stopped in front of the heavy double-glass doors of the main boardroom. She pushed them open. The room was massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city skyline. A long, custom mahogany table dominated the center of the space. 12 men in expensive dark suits sat around the wood. Richard, the lead investor from the dinner party a few months ago, sat at the right side of the table, cussed. He was holding a gold pen. Vance stood at the head of the table. He was pointing an expensive laser pointer at a projected financial graph on the wall. He was halfway through a sentence about quarterly asset shielding. He stopped talking. The second Clara walked in. The entire room felt completely silent. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the central air conditioning blowing from the ceiling. Clara, Vance said. His voice was laced with patronizing annoyance. He looked at her as if she were a lost child who had wandered into traffic. This is a closed executive board meeting. You do not belong here. Please wait in the lobby, or I will have security escort you out. Clara did not stop walking. She moved steadily down the length of the room. She bypassed Vance completely and took a position at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. Harrison stood firmly at her right shoulder. "I have every right to be here, Vance," Clara said. Her voice was perfectly calm. It did not shake. It echoed clearly in the large room. "In fact, this executive meeting cannot legally proceed without my explicit authorization." Richard frowned deeply. He set his gold pen down on his legal pad. He looked at Vance, then back at Clara. "Vance, what exactly is going on here?" Richard asked. His tone was sharp. "And who is this man?" Harrison stepped forward. He did not smile. "My name is Harrison." "Caldwell," Harrison said. "I am Mrs. Sterling's legal counsel. We are here to correct a massive, fraudulent administrative error regarding the fundamental ownership structure of Vanguard Development." Vance let out a loud, mocking laugh. It was a classic deflection tactic. Deny and ridicule. "Ownership structure?" Vance sneered. He looked around the table, trying to bring the other men in on the joke. "Clara owns absolutely nothing. She was bought out of her initial consultant shares 5 years ago. Gentlemen, please excuse this interruption. My wife recently gave birth, and she is going through a very emotional, irrational episode regarding our separation." Clara did not blink. She let him dig his grave deeper. "That statement is entirely incorrect," Harrison said. Harrison lifted the first heavy black binder. He held it high for a second, then dropped it onto the mahogany table. Thud. The heavy, violent sound cracked like a gunshot in the quiet room. Harrison opened the binder. He pulled out a thick stack of aged, yellowing parchment paper. He slid the documents down the polished wood. They stopped directly in front of Richard. "Those are the original, unaltered incorporation patents for this holding company," Harrison stated. "They were drafted, filed, and registered 7 years ago by Clara Sterling. Those documents clearly dictate a permanent 50-50 ownership split of all intellectual property, foundational assets, and future subsidiaries. Those patents were never legally dissolved. They were merely hidden under layers of dummy corporate shells by your chief executive officer." Vance's face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his hand on the table. "That is ancient history," Vance shouted. His charm was completely gone. "Those patents are entirely irrelevant. We executed a comprehensive wealth management restructuring agreement just last month. She willingly forfeited any remaining trace of equity. She signed it right in front of a state notary in my own living room." Vance looked triumphant. He crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at Richard, waiting for the older man to dismiss Clara. Clara looked directly at Vance. Her eyes were completely cold. "Did you ever actually read the final copy of that agreement, Vance?" Clara asked quietly. "Did you bother to read the middle pages before you put your pen to the paper and handed it to the notary?" Vance froze. The arrogant smugness vanished from his eyes in an instant. It was replaced by a sudden, creeping terror. Harrison lifted the second black binder. He dropped it onto the table next to the first one. Thud. "This is the official, notarized restructuring agreement executed last month," Harrison said. He opened the binder to page 42. He slid the open book down the table toward Richard. "I strongly encourage the board to read clause 7 very carefully." Richard picked up his reading glasses. He slid them onto his nose. He pulled the heavy binder closer. The room was deathly quiet. Clara could hear the faint, rapid ticking of Vance's expensive gold, watched from 30 feet away. Tick, tick, tick. Richard read the page. His eyes widened. He read it a second time. A deep red color began to creep up his neck. He looked up at Vance in absolute, unadulterated shock. "Vance," Richard said. His voice was thick with fury. "This clause does not forfeit her shares. Clause explicitly binds her original 50% ownership to any and all of your current personal and corporate holdings. It grants her equal voting power. You signed this. You literally handed her half of everything we have built." Vance lunged forward across the table. He snatched the heavy binder from Richard's hands. His eyes scanned the words. His hands began to shake violently. The paper rattled against the metal rings. "This is a forgery," Vance yelled, voice cracked, losing its smooth baritone pitch. "She swapped the pages. She tricked me. This is illegal. You presented a legally binding document in front of a licensed state notary." Harrison answered smoothly, his voice devoid of any pity. "My client simply signed the contract that was placed on the table. If you failed to read the contract you executed, That is a catastrophic failure of your executive duty. It is not a forgery. It is negligence. Vance stared at Clara. The blood completely drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just stepped confidently off a cliff, only to look down and realize there was no ground beneath him. You, Vance whispered. Me, Clara said. She walked a few steps closer down the side of the table. I built the very foundation of this company, Vance. I let you take the credit because I believed in our marriage. But when you decided to steal my life's work to fund your penthouse for Juliet, you made a fatal miscalculation. You forgot that I am the one who wrote the blueprints. Clara turned away from him. She looked directly at Richard, then slowly looked at every other investor at the table. Gentlemen, Clara said. Her voice was commanding. It was the voice of a chief executive. As an official 50% stakeholder with equal voting rights, I am calling for an immediate board vote of no confidence in Vance Sterling. His erratic personal behavior, his hidden subsidiary expenditures, and his gross negligence in handling legally binding corporate contracts are a direct, active threat to our investments. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. No one moved, no one defended Vance. Richard looked at the trembling paper in Vance's hand. Then Richard looked back at Clara. He took off his reading glasses and set them carefully on his legal pad. I second the motion, Richard said quietly. Vance collapsed backward. He fell into his heavy leather chair as if all the bones in his legs had suddenly dissolved. The billion-dollar empire he thought he fully controlled was burning to the ground in real time, dust, and he was holding the match. Clara did not stay to watch the vote. The outcome was already decided. She had broken his world. She turned her back on her husband. She walked out of the boardroom with Harrison right behind her, dust. The heavy glass doors swung shut, sealing Vance inside his own tomb. 10 minutes later, Clara stepped out of the Vanguard building. The icy winter wind hit her face instantly. It stung her cheeks. It whipped her hair around her face. It felt magnificent. It felt exactly like freedom. She left Harrison at the curb and walked 2 blocks down the busy city avenue. The sidewalks were crowded with people rushing back to their office buildings, bundled up in heavy coats and scarves. No one looked twice at her. No one knew what she had just accomplished. She was just another face in the crowd. She stopped at a small, battered metal food cart on the street corner. The rich smell of roasted nuts and hot baking dough cut through the freezing air. "1 large pretzel, please," Clara said to the vendor, with yellow mustard. The vendor handed her a warm, grease-stained paper bag. She handed him a $5 bill. She did not wait for the change. Clara walked across the street into a small, snow-dusted public park. She found an empty wooden bench facing a frozen stone fountain. She sat down. The wood was freezing against her heavy coat. She opened the paper bag. Thick steam rose from the hot pretzel, carrying the sharp, tangy, wonderful scent of the mustard. She took a slow bite. The dough was soft, warm, and perfectly salty. A small flock of gray city pigeons landed on the freezing cobblestones near her boots. They bobbed their heads up and down in a jerky, rhythmic motion, waiting patiently for her to drop crumbs. Clara sat there in the freezing cold. She did not pull her phone out of her pocket. She did not check her messages. She did not think about the mountain of legal paperwork that would follow tomorrow. She just chewed her food slowly. She watched the gray pigeons pace across the ice. She listened to the distant, muffled hum of the city traffic. She sat there for 4 long minutes in absolute, sensory peace. The war was won. The deafening noise in her head had finally stopped. She was sitting in the cold, eating a cheap pretzel, and for the first time in 7 years, she was finally breathing her own air. The mechanical whine of the industrial paper shredder filled the executive office. Whir, crunch, whir. Vance Sterling stood over the machine. He was 37 years old, but today he looked 50. His expensive navy suit jacket was thrown carelessly over a leather armchair. His silk tie was pulled loose. He fed another stack of confidential financial documents into the metal teeth of the shredder. The board of directors had not just voted him out of the chief executive officer chair. They had completely locked him out of the company's servers. He was given 48 hours to clear his personal belongings from the corner office he had designed himself. He reached for his phone on the mahogany desk. He opened his primary banking application. He typed his passcode with shaking thumbs. The screen loaded. A red banner appeared across the top. Account frozen pending legal review. Vance threw the phone across the room. It shattered against the thick glass window. The web of cracked glass spidered outward, ruining the perfect, dizzying view of the city he used to own. The heavy office door opened. Vance turned around, his chest heaving. He expected to see a security guard coming to rush him along. Instead, Juliet walked in. She was wearing a sleek beige trench coat. Her perfect hair was tied back in a severe, tight bun. She did not look at him with sympathy. She did not rush over to comfort him. She stood just inside the doorway, her posture rigid and cold. Juliet, Vance breathed, relief, washing over his panicked face. He took a step toward her. Thank God, it is a complete disaster today. But I have a plan. We just need to move to the Cayman accounts. We can stay at the Orient penthouse until the dust settles. My lawyers are going to tear Clara apart. Juliet did not move. She reached into the pocket of her trench coat. She pulled out a small, heavy ring of keys. She tossed them onto his desk. They landed with a sharp, metallic clatter. Clang! What is this? Vance asked. He stared at the keys. Those are the keys to the Orient penthouse, Juliet said. Her voice was entirely flat. It sounded exactly like the voice he used when firing mid-level managers. I am breaking the lease. I have already cleared out my belongings. Vance stopped breathing. He looked at her neck. The $45,000 teardrop diamond pendant was gone. Her collarbone was bare. Juliet, what are you doing? Vance asked. His voice cracked with a pathetic, desperate edge. You cannot leave me right now. I need you. Juliet tilted her head slightly. She looked at him with an expression of pure, calculating pity. You taught me everything I know about business, Vance, Juliet said smoothly. You taught me to always secure my assets. You taught me to cut loose any failing investments before they drag my portfolio down. You are a failing investment, Vance. Your assets are frozen. Your company just kicked you out. You have nothing. I love you, Vance whispered, grasping at the last remaining string of his massive ego. Juliet let out a short, hollow laugh. It was a terrifying sound. You do not love me, Vance. You loved that I made you feel young. You loved that I was a secret you could keep from your brilliant wife. But the secret is out, and the money is gone. I accepted a senior director position at a rival firm this morning. She reached into her coat one last time. She pulled out her plastic Vanguard security badge. She dropped it on the floor. Goodbye, Vance, Juliet said. She turned and walked out of the office. She did not look back. Vance was left standing alone in the center of the room. The paper shredder hummed loudly in the corner. The smell of empty cardboard boxes and ozone filled the air. He had spent 7 years building a life based entirely on transaction and greed. And now he was entirely bankrupt. 2 weeks later, the final execution of the empire took place in a much quieter room. Clara sat across from Harrison Caldwell in his mahogany-lined office. The winter snow had finally begun to melt outside, leaving the city streets wet and shining under the weak February sun. Harrison opened a thick manila folder. He pulled out a crisp white legal document. It was the final settlement decree. The board of directors moved exactly as we anticipated, Harrison said. His silver pen tapped rhythmically against the desk. Tap, tap, honked. They want the bad press to disappear immediately. They consider Vance to be a catastrophic liability. But they also know that your 50% voting power could block their upcoming mergers. Clara remained perfectly still. She listened intently. Just. The board forced Vance into a mandatory buyout, Harrison continued. He has officially purchased your 50% equity share in Vanguard Development. But because his liquid accounts were frozen by the divorce petition, he had to completely liquidate his personal portfolio to generate the capital. Harrison slid a sheet of paper toward Clara. It was a list of assets. Clara scanned the black ink. Vance had been forced to sell his custom, charcoal gray sports car at a massive loss. He had been forced to liquidate his private stock in the Orion Towers. He had to sell his collection of vintage watches. And the massive glass penthouse in the sky, the one with the freezing air conditioning and the silent, echoing halls, was currently listed on the market. He sold everything, Clara stated. It was not a question. It was a realization. He sold everything he cherished to pay you what you are owed. Harrison corrected gently. The funds cleared the escrow account this morning. Exactly $240 million after taxes. It is sitting safely in your private trust. Clara looked at the number written on the page. $240 million. It was an incomprehensible amount of wealth. But to Clara, it was just ink on a page. The money did not make her heart beat faster. The money was not the victory. The money was just the heavy, blunt instrument she used to crush his ego. And the custody arrangement? Clara asked. This was the only paper that truly mattered. Harrison smiled. It was a warm, genuine smile. He slid the final page across the desk. Full physical and legal custody is granted to you, Harrison said. Because Vance currently has no permanent physical residence, and due to his documented erratic behavior at the corporate level, the judge granted him heavily restricted visitation. He is allowed one supervised visit every other weekend, and he pays for the supervisor. Clara picked up the heavy silver pen. The metal was cool against her fingers. She did not hesitate. She signed her name at the bottom of the page. The blue ink flowed smoothly over the paper. It was over. The cage was locked. The war was officially won. Late that afternoon, Clara was standing in the nursery of her new home. She had not bought another penthouse in the sky. She had purchased a beautiful, historic brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street in Brooklyn. It had solid brick walls, warm cherry wood floors, and massive windows that opened to let the fresh air inside. It felt grounded. It felt safe. Sunlight poured through the nursery window, casting a warm golden glow across the room. The harsh, bitter winter was finally retreating. Clara sat in a plush, velvet rocking chair. She held her daughter against her chest. The baby was sleeping soundly, wrapped in the soft yellow blanket Clara had meticulously folded on the floor of her old life. The room smelled of lavender baby lotion and fresh linen. It was a beautiful, peaceful scent. Clara gently rocked the chair back and forth. The wooden runners creaked softly against the floorboards. Creak, creak. She hummed a soft, wordless lullaby. The vibration in her chest soothed the sleeping infant. Clara looked down at her daughter's tiny, perfect face. She thought about the terrified, exhausted woman she had been 6 months ago. She thought about the woman who stood in a massive walk-in closet, staring at a receipt for a teardrop diamond, wondering if her entire life was a lie. That woman was gone. The fire of the betrayal had burned her away entirely. Clara leaned her head back against the chair. She closed her eyes and let the warm sunlight wash over her face. Theft. The millions of dollars in her bank account meant she would never have to rely on anyone ever again. It meant her daughter would have the best education in the world. It meant security. But the true justice was not the wealth. The true justice was the absolute deafening silence from the man who thought he could erase her. He tried to bury me. He forgot I was a seed. Clara stopped rocking. For a moment, she pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her baby-yes warm head. She opened her eyes and looked out the window at the blue sky. She did not feel angry anymore. She did not feel bitter. She just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. I built him, Clara whispered into the quiet, sunlit room, her voice a fierce, absolute declaration of truth. And I was strong enough to dismantle him. She resumed rocking. Back and forth, back and forth. The sound of her soft humming filled the house, pushing out the last remaining shadows of a brilliant, terrible summer. 1 year later, mid-April, the spring arrived in the city without warning. The heavy gray slush of winter melted away overnight. It was replaced by blooming cherry blossoms and brilliant, clear blue skies. Clara sat behind a smooth oak desk in her Brooklyn office. The room was flooded with natural sunlight. It did not look like a traditional, sterile corporate office. The walls were painted a soft, warm sage green. A large velvet sofa sat in the corner. The air smelled of fresh espresso and blooming jasmine. Clara was 33 years old. She wore a tailored cream blazer. Her blonde hair fell in soft, loose waves around her shoulders. She looked rested. She looked powerful. Across the desk sat a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor was 45 years old. Her hands were shaking violently as she gripped a paper coffee cup. She was holding a manila folder filled with hidden credit card statements she had just discovered in her husband's golf bag. Eleanor looked exactly the way Clara had felt 1 year ago. Terrified, ashamed, completely unmoored. He told me I was crazy, Eleanor whispered, a single tear cutting through her perfectly applied foundation. He told me the money was lost in a bad market investment. I believed him. I feel so incredibly stupid. Clara leaned forward. She did not offer a pitying smile. She offered a look of absolute, unyielding solidarity. You are not stupid, Eleanor, Clara said quietly. You trusted the person who swore to protect you. That is a virtue, not a flaw. He weaponized your trust. That is his failure. Clara opened her leather notebook. She picked up her silver pen. Tussed. Over the past year, Clara had taken a portion of her massive settlement and opened a boutique financial firm. She specialized exclusively in forensic accounting and asset protection for women navigating high-net-worth divorces. She was reinventing herself. She used her brilliant, analytical mind to build life rafts for women who were drowning. We are going to trace every single dollar, Clara said. Her voice was steady and calm. We will freeze his secondary accounts. We will secure your residential equity. By the time he realizes you know the truth, you will already hold the keys to your own freedom. Eleanor let out a long, shaky breath. The panic in her eyes slowly began to recede, replaced by a tiny, fragile spark of hope. As Clara looked at her new client, a profound realization washed over her. She finally understood that the prison door had been unlocked the whole time. She had been her own jailer. The hardest part was not surviving him. The hardest part was forgiving herself for staying blind for so long. But sitting here, using her pain to shield another woman, the last lingering ghost of her own guilt finally vanished. Let us begin, Clara said. The silver pen scratched against the thick paper. Scratch! Scratch. It was the sound of a woman taking her life back. At noon, Clara left her office to walk to a nearby bakery. The air outside was crisp and sweet. She walked down the bustling Brooklyn pavement. The street was alive with noise. Delivery trucks rumbled over the cobblestones. A distant saxophone played a jazz melody. The rich, yeasty smell of baking bread drifted from the corner cafe. Clara stopped at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. She glanced across the busy street. A man was standing outside a mid-level commercial real estate office, holding a cheap paper coffee cup. It was Vance. Clara froze for a fraction of a second. She had not seen him since the day in the hospital. Harrison had handled all the property transfers and legal filings. Vance was 38 years old, but he looked entirely diminished. He was wearing a gray suit, but it was not custom-tailored. It was off the rack, slightly loose around the shoulders. His posture was slumped. The charismatic, arrogant spark that used to radiate from him was completely extinguished. The gray hair at his temples no longer looked distinguished. It just looked exhausted. According to Harrison, Vance had managed to secure a mid-level consulting job after his assets were wiped out. He lived in a small, rented apartment in Queens. He was just an average struggling man fighting the daily corporate grind. The pedestrian light turned green. A digital bell chimed. Ding! Ding! Clara stepped off the curb. Vance looked up. Across the sea of walking pedestrians and yellow taxicabs, his eyes locked onto hers. He stopped drinking his coffee. His eyes widened in shock. He took a hesitant, uncertain half-step toward the edge of the sidewalk. He looked like a man seeing a ghost of the paradise he had foolishly burned to the ground. He opened his mouth. Kes. He looked as though he wanted to cross the street. He wanted to speak to her. Clara looked directly into his eyes. A year ago, seeing him would have sent a spike of violent adrenaline straight into her heart. She would have felt blinding rage or profound shattering grief. Today, she felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger. There was no lingering sadness. There was only a vast, empty indifference. Looking at him felt like looking at a stranger's reading a newspaper on a subway train. He simply did not matter to her reality anymore. Clara did not smile. She did not frown. She simply looked away. She continued walking across the street. The heels of her shoes clicked steadily against the pavement. Click, click, click. She walked past him, keeping her steady pace, blending into the vibrant spring crowd. She did not turn her head to look back. She did not care if he watched her walk away. She was entirely free. 10 minutes later, Clara unlocked the heavy oak door of her Brooklyn brownstone. The house was bathed in afternoon light. Maeve was sitting on the living room rug, building a tower of brightly colored wooden blocks. Sitting across from Maeve was Clara's 1-year-old daughter. The little girl had a head full of soft golden curls. She let out a loud, joyful squeal and knocked the wooden tower to the floor. The blocks scattered with a loud clatter. Clack, clack. Hey, Maeve laughed, holding her hands up in mock surrender. I spent 10 minutes building that masterpiece. Clara smiled. It was a deep, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She set her leather briefcase down by the door. She took off her tailored blazer and draped it over the banister. She walked across the warm cherry wood floor. She did not sit down immediately. Instead, Clara walked to the massive bay windows overlooking the small private garden in the back of the house. The glass was heavy. She reached up and unlatched the brass lock. She pushed the heavy window up. The crisp, sweet spring breeze rushed into the warm room. It carried the scent of damp earth, blooming cherry blossoms, and distant rain. Clara closed her eyes. She stood perfectly still, letting the cool wind wash over her face. She lingered there for a long moment, feeling the physical sensation of the air moving through her home. It was not the freezing, artificial air conditioning of the glass penthouse. It was real. It was alive. She took a deep, cleansing breath, in, out. Mama, a tiny voice called out. Clara opened her eyes. She turned around. Her daughter was holding a small yellow block, reaching her chubby arms up toward Clara. Clara walked over and sank to her knees. On the soft rug, she gathered her daughter into her arms. The baby was warm, smelling of milk and lavender soap. She buried her face in Clara's neck, letting out a soft, contented sigh. Maeve looked at Clara. Maeve's eyes were soft, filled with quiet pride. How was the new client today? She is going to be fine, Clara answered softly. We are going to make sure she is fine. Clara rested her chin on her daughter's soft hair. She looked around the beautiful, grounded home she had bought with her own resilience. Tand. She thought about the boutique firm she had built to protect others. She thought about the immense, quiet joy that now filled her daily life. The journey had begun in a suffocating, brilliant summer, built entirely on lies. It had descended into a brutal, agonizing winter of betrayal and isolation. But she had survived the frost. She had walked through the fire and the snow. And now the spring had arrived. Clara held her daughter tighter. A profound sense of gratitude settled deep into her bones. She was not just a survivor of a ruined marriage. She was a mother, a protector, and the undeniable master of her own destiny. Starting over had once felt completely impossible, but staying in the shadow of his lies would have been a tragedy. Clara looked at the sunlight streaming through the open window. We have everything we need, Clara whispered, her voice a gentle, unbreakable promise to the child in her arms. The wind blew gently through the room, rustling the leaves of the potted plants. It was the sound of complete, absolute peace. The story of Vanguard development was over, but Clara's beautiful, hard-won life was just beginning.
We often measure power in numbers, in bank accounts, in square footage, in the titles written on the frosted glass of executive office doors. Vance Sterling believed that was all that mattered. He viewed his life as a ledger. His wife was a depreciating asset he could easily write off, and his mistress was a shiny new investment. He confused arrogance with intelligence. He believed that because Clara had chosen a life of quiet support, she had forgotten how to go to war. But the true victory in this story is in the $240 million, sitting in Clara's private trust. It is the moment Vance was escorted out of his own building, stripped of his wealth and his pride. The ultimate triumph is the final scene. It is the moment Clara sees the man who nearly destroyed her standing across the street. And she feels absolutely nothing. No anger, no grief. Just the vast, peaceful indifference of a woman who has entirely reclaimed her soul. Clara's journey teaches us a profound lesson about the illusion of being trapped. We sometimes allow ourselves to become soft. We hand over the keys to our own kingdoms for the sake of love, comfort, or the illusion of security. We let our instincts dull. But when the winter comes, when the ultimate betrayal forces us out into the freezing cold, we remember who we really are. This story shows us that emotions can be a liability if you let them explode in the heat of the moment. But when you flash freeze your panic into pure, calculating determination, it becomes an unstoppable weapon. Clara didn't win by fighting loud. She won by fighting smart. She didn't break the rules. She used the very system Vance thought he controlled to meticulously dismantle him, brick by brick. She reminds us that you are never the victim of your story, unless you choose to stay on the floor. Let Clara be a reminder to all of us. Never forget your own worth. Never stop protecting your independence. And never, ever underestimate the quiet ones because while the loudest person in the room is busy performing, the quietest person is writing the blueprints for their downfall. The hardest part is not surviving the storm. The hardest part is forgiving yourself for not seeing the clouds gathering sooner. But once you do, the spring that follows is entirely yours. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.